Hello and welcome to week 2's lecture entitled What is Research? So we're going to pick up some of the themes that we looked at last week. By now you will have made your forum posts and discussed them in the seminar, and we're starting to think quite seriously about the research process and how you go about becoming better researchers than you already are. We've already started to discuss in seminars the kinds of research that you've taken part in the past and that you've carried out in the past as part of your studies. And we're going to build on that this week. So I've titled this an introduction to qualitative, quantitative and mixed methods research, because we're going to be talking about all three of those approaches this week. And I want you to begin this week by actually pausing this recording, having a short break and looking critically at the posters that I've put up in our Moodle space for this week. So those are from research projects that I've been part of. And essentially they're reporting findings of research projects. I want you to think about them critically, engaging not so much with the presentation, although you might want to say something about that because it does factor into how the public and how other researchers understand our results. So for example, if you want to tell me that my bar charts are too small, that's absolutely fine. That's a valid criticism of presentation of results. I wanted us to think though perhaps on a deeper level about the research methods that have been used that these posters are reporting and the evaluation particularly of the findings. So what do the researchers make of what they found? Do you think that they are trying to say too much on the basis of too little data? Do you think there is too much data and that they are presenting it poorly? Do you think they've cherry-picked data? Is there data there that you think is missing that you would like to see that might perhaps disprove what they're claiming? So are they presenting, in short, a balanced overview of their findings? Is there anything missing? Have they told you clearly enough? Remembering always that it's a poster, but have they told you enough about what they did for you to understand clearly what they did? Have they engaged with ethical issues properly? Have they related to you what informants were told about the kind of research they were taking part in? And I want you to just write one comment, and we will get repeated comments, so people will find the same things. That doesn't invalidate what you're finding at all. So if you pick on something and you find that somebody's already reported it, it doesn't matter. Report it again and say why it jumped out at you as being very important. So do go to the online forum that I've put up for this purpose. Please write at least one comment. You may also reply to somebody else's comment. So do write a comment. If you also have time, inclination, and this is good. It's good to engage with each other and to build on each other's understanding. We're here to sort of help each other understand. If you think that somebody's picked up on something and you don't quite agree, or you think that the decision the researcher made was poor, then you may say to them, I thought this particular mistake was even more egregious. I think that this is even worse than that particular error that the researchers made. And for me, that's worse. You can engage in conversation with each other, and indeed I want you to do this. This is part of learning in this mixed methods way that we're doing, because some of our learning is face-to-face, some of our learning is online, and if we're going to learn in a deep way online, we have to communicate with each other online, so the forum is crucial for this exercise. So, please, you can either do this at the end of this lecture, or you can pause it right now and go and have a look at the posters. Certainly don't sit through an entire online lecture without pausing the screen a couple of times. Please get yourself drinks, snacks, engage, make notes, come back to this resource. It's subtitled, it's not going anywhere. Take your time with listening to lectures online. Okay. Assuming that we've all had a go at this exercise of looking at the posters, then we're going to carry on with this lecture by beginning with the question, what is a research problem? Now, Strauss and Corbin in their Social Methods textbook define a research problem as the general area of focus for the research, or the substantive area of focus. That is, it might not be the only problem within the research, but it's the one that you select for your focus. Okay? And it's general. A research problem in itself doesn't have to be clearly defined at the outset. It's simply some issue that you wish to engage with and conduct research on. Okay, so you don't have to define it very well at the outset. That will come as you do the work around this, but it's an area that you wish to focus on. And we can go back to Moodle, possibly at the end of this lecture, and discuss a little bit more some previous projects you've worked on, not restricted to English language, so you can discuss any research that you have carried out. And indeed, I'm going to kick us off by reporting on a medical research trial that I took part in because I suffer from epilepsy. So I'll tell you a little bit about how medical research trials work and the kinds of questions that get asked and the kind of research problems that medical researchers face, which will throw what we do into sharp relief because there are many things that they will have in common. They have a problem that they need to solve. In many ways they have it easier because if you research within the British NHS, the National Health Service, you have access to data. So you have access to anonymised data and you can apply to research on a database of people who have epilepsy. The people who have epilepsy do not have to give their express permission for you to use their anonymised data. So in that sense, medical ethics functions rather differently to the way that we will use ethical concepts to inform what we do. In another way, they might have extra problems, and you will see that when you come to look at my post, because what I'm going to talk about is a trial for women who were pregnant. So people trying to have children who are taking anticonvulsant drugs. And that raises issues of its own. There aren't actually very many of us in any given year taking a particular drug trying to have children. So we'll think about that. So we're going to turn now to the concept of research design. Research design then is the plan and includes the plan for carrying out empirical research. Remember that empirical research is research that is data driven. So we arrive at our conclusions having collected a data set and analysed it and observed likely patterns from that data. Research design refers to systematic application of methods, and systematic is important because we can't just put the methods in any old order. So we need to understand, for example, in which order we're going to carry out the various steps of our method. And there might be two valid ways of doing something, but one might be more justifiable than the other when we look at the literature. So we're going to have to do literature review as well. Okay, so the systematic application then of methods is part of our research design. We need to understand how we will collect and how we will analyse data, and those decisions will directly influence the kinds of things that we can say at the end of our research. So the decisions that we make will influence the kind of conclusions we can draw. Moreover, research design illustrates how data collection and analysis relate to each other. So they do relate to each other. The kind of data we collect will influence what we can analyse. So if we collect numerical data that can be transformed into number values, then we will be able to do quantitative analysis. We might even be able to do statistical analysis if it's appropriate. If we have enough data and if it patterns in particular ways, then we can run certain statistical tests to check how likely it is that these results are by chance, or how likely it is that there's a causal relationship between two variables. If, however, we're collecting data which doesn't lend itself to transformation into numerical points, then we might be doing qualitative research. So if, for example, we conduct a focus group or an open-ended questionnaire, it's very hard, in fact it's impossible, many people would argue, to transform things like attitudes into a point scale. So if we say something to people like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like regional accents? That is problematic, and we will talk about why that's problematic, why assigning numerical values to things like psychological states is a problem later on in this module. And the kinds of decisions that we make about how to collect data and how to analyse it are directly related to what we can say about what we've done. Okay, we can't say, based on a scenario where we ask 20 people to give us their opinions from 1 to 10 on a range of accents, we cannot extrapolate at that and say that because we asked those people in Coventry that it applies to the whole of the city of Coventry. That would be rather problematic and rather ambitious to say that our 20-person sample applied to everybody in Coventry, because obviously people in Coventry are not a homogeneous mass. They might have different life experiences, different psychological states when they hear different dialects, different reasons for favouring dialects. So you can see already how complex a particular research design could get. What do we do? How do we try to say something about the whole of the city of Coventry and the people within it and their attitudes to dialects? Can we make generalisations like that? And we're back to this age-old discussion of which is better, empirical approaches, data-driven approaches versus rational approaches. So we'll think about that again this week. So remember last week we were talking about the laws of gravity and apples falling down from trees and Newton observing this. We will come back to that. Yeah, so Newton, I think, already had a theory of gravity before he watched the apple drop to the floor. In many ways, we might argue that although he was promulgating a rationalist approach, so he was arguing that one could have a hypothesis which one then interrogated with data to disprove or prove it, he already had an idea before he saw the apple fall to the ground, but this helped to cement his idea. So really, in some ways, there isn't a terribly huge distinction between empirical and rationalist approaches. But the kinds of research that we will do together will be firmly empirical. So we will be data-driven. We will be gathering data. And we will be interrogating, hopefully some of you will be interrogating large data sets. Some of you will be working with qualitative data, which tends to work with richer, more complicated data, but from a smaller number of informants or a smaller number of sources. And often it's much harder work. So in terms of producing definite results, because it works with smaller data sets. So we can say, Newton had theorized gravity, and in a way the one apple falling to the floor was a teeny tiny bit of empirical evidence, but his approach was strictly rational. He had hypothesized already that this happened. We could look at someone like Archimedes in his bathtub watching water displacement and coming up with a theory of displacement. Was he empirical or was he rational? Well, again, he was primarily rational. He'd already rationed out that if a body falls into a body of water, then the water goes somewhere and is displaced, and why does this happen? He'd already got some idea in his head about why this was happening. But it did need that spark of empirical observation to allow him to cement this rational hypothesis, and then test it, and in fact what he hypothesizes is true. He did need this minute, this sort of eureka minute, eureka meaning I have it, yes? So he needed this minute in his bathtub to kind of help him cement this reasoning, this rational hypothesis. So in some ways he was a little bit empirical as well. If what we believe about him having a bath is true, if he really did formulate his theory of displacement in the bath, then he needed that bathtub moment, if you like. So, as we've said, our approach in this module will be that we favour empirical approaches. We favour data collection. We favour looking at events in the real world and extrapolating conclusions from those, rather than simply hypothesizing on the basis of very little evidence. There is a place for such rational hypothesis making, but it isn't this module. We will be working firmly with social phenomena which are deeply complex and which are hard to hypothesize about. They are hard to try and draw conclusions about. So we will be taking an empirical approach. And within that, we have two approaches. How do we get data? If we find data hard to get, we could use secondary data. That is, we could use data that has already been collected and possibly even analysed by other people. So there will be data sets, and I'm sure you can already think of a few scenarios where you would like to work with data, but it's very hard to get hold of. For example, if I want to look at how people communicate in the prison system, it's very, very hard for me to get access to prisons. The Criminal Justice Service, for fairly good reasons, is reluctant to grant the general public access to prisons. But what I might do is get secondary data from programs that have been filmed in prisons. So I could certainly look at fly-on-the-wall documentaries where conversational data has been gathered in prison. And I'm sure we can all think of these kinds of documentaries. They appear fairly regularly on Channel 4 and Netflix. You may know of some of these documentaries. We can look at this secondary data that's been collected, and we can impose an analysis on it. And this does sort of avoid the risk of reinventing the wheel. It also enables us to access situations that might otherwise be out of bounds for us. One prime example of this is something that often happens in the sciences. So if somebody has a hypothesis about the relationship perhaps between statins and blood pressure, and they want to see if statins have actually helped to lower blood pressure worldwide, then what they can do is called a meta-analysis, and that is they look at lots and lots of reviews across the world. So they will look at statin trials in India, statin trials in Ghana, statin trials in the Republic of Ireland, and they will conflate these results. So they will look across a large population of people and come to some conclusions about worldwide how statins are working to reduce blood pressure. And when you take a huge long lens view like that, you often come up with some quite startling results. And we do see that across the world, these kinds of review trials have shown that statins perhaps are not lowering blood pressure effectively as people thought they were. So we can take a very, very wide data set that has already been analysed, and we can kind of reanalyse it We can reapply tools to it to see if hypotheses hold across larger data sets. That's secondary data. Another good example is using a literature review. So we will teach you in this module how to carry out literature reviews. That is, we look at research that's already happened in our area. So what I now want you to do is take 5 minutes and go to the assessment page and have a look at the number of topics that I have published for you to work on for your assessment, because we're going to begin to do this week. We're going to start thinking about how we're going to carry out our assessment. And you can start thinking about a literature review. That is analysis of prior research in your area. When you've had a look at the list of topics and familiarised yourself with them, then come back to this lecture. Because what many of you will be doing in this particular module is using primary data. That is data collected and analysed by the researcher, e.g. you. It provides entirely new insights because it's new data. And that could be questionnaires, interviews, it could be gathering adverts from Lonely Hearts columns. I'm just thinking of some projects that I've supervised. It could be gathering a big corpus of multilingual signposts in a multilingual city like Quebec. It could be gathering multilingual signposts in a place like Coventry. It could be, and you might gather a huge body of those, a corpus, and apply certain methods to see which languages are represented, how they're represented, are they represented accurately, are they spelt accurately, who are the signs directed at. But primary data. So many of you, as you carry out your project, though not all of you, will be gathering primary data. But whether you use primary or secondary data, there are some things that do bind good research, okay? So good research has researchers, okay? Fairly obviously. Good research has researchers involved in it. We can't do any work without researchers. Researchers are not necessarily highly qualified, though, and you're just coming into this field and you're going to learn by carrying out research. But all good research has a literature review associated with it. That is, we take on board the insights of our colleagues. So if we want to research multilingual signposts in Coventry, then we would read about methods that have been used with multilingual signposting to investigate what they mean, why they appear. And we would find that there is a significant body of work on something called linguistic landscapes, so that people have already begun to look at signage. And what they've said is things like, it matters which language goes first on the signpost. In any community, the language at the top is generally the most important, maybe culturally or in terms of the economy, or perhaps it relates to the amount of people in the population who speak that language. So we will find that there is a considerable body of literature already out there on multilingual signposts, and it would be foolish, foolhardy, and also not accountable to start our research without reading that literature, not least because we might have something to add. We have to perform research where there is a gap in needs, where something needs clarifying, where something hasn't been done before. So in fact we would find that there isn't much peer-reviewed research on multilingual signage in the West Midlands, and that it might be quite a good idea to look at that. But we need to look at the West Midlands context. That is, we need to know a little bit more about the kinds of languages that we could expect to find in Coventry, the kinds of people who live in Coventry. We need to know about things like the City Council's policy for languages. Do they allow for multilingual signage? Is that something that happens in the UK? Those of you who come from Wales or have ever travelled to the Highlands of Scotland will know that there are areas of the UK that specifically legislate for and pay for multilingual signage. Does it ever happen anywhere else? If we don't do the literature review thoroughly, we don't know this, and we may risk wasting time reinventing the wheel, as Dernier put it, and even making mistakes. So we can avoid mistakes if we read the literature, and if we do a proper review of the literature and present that to our audience, we will situate our research in its proper place. Good research also has a methodology and methods. So it has a way of proceeding, and it has tools to help it proceed. We select appropriate tools to help it proceed. Now, if we wanted to carry out our linguistic landscape project, it's quite likely that a camera would figure in our work. Or if we were unable to get out into the city of Coventry and photograph because, for example, we were trapped in a lockdown pandemic, then we might want to use the internet as a source of photographs. But we would have to be aware that there might be restrictions. You know, how much have people photographed of Coventry? Why have they photographed it? I have a friend who photographs cities, but he doesn't do it to look at linguistic landscapes specifically. He does it because it fascinates him, and he photographs lots of things, canals, people, shops, but in his photography he happens to capture multilingual signposts. So I could, for example, ask him for a kind of secondary data set to get round this business of being trapped inside because of a pandemic, but I'd have to bear in mind that his data set is too wide and it needs narrowing down. And that in narrowing it down, I might make it too narrow. He might have missed some things because he doesn't go to certain areas of the city because they don't interest him. Perhaps he's missed, for example, a small corpus of Polish signage that you can see in the window of the Polish shop. So I would have to think about this. I'd have to think about my sampling. That would be my sampling. How much data do I take? Where do I take it from? Yeah, I'd have to think about my sampling. I'd have to think about the instruments that I need to analyse my data. So am I going to use some of the methods that I've read about in linguistic landscape research? Am I going to look at my signposts and just look at which language appears first? Or shall I maybe look at the font? Shall I look at the size of the letters? Should I look at colours? Shall I look at images on the signpost, or just restrict myself to writing? If I'm not looking at a language that is left to right, so for example, if I'm doing this work in an Arabic country, I need to look right to left. I'm going to have to be aware of all of this when I actually analyse the data. And more than that, I need a research question. Now we'll come on to why we need a research question. Research questions are crucial because they help to direct our focus. We've talked about having a research topic, but that's very broad. We've noticed an issue. So for example, we've noticed that in Coventry there are some shops that have bilingual signs. And we want to know why. We want to know why is that? Why is it only some shops that have bilingual signs? We thought Coventry was monolingual. We thought just English was spoken in Coventry before we came here. This is a big surprise to us. Actually, we can take some of this surprise away by doing the literature review, which will reveal that Coventry is a multilingual city and has been so for a long time. And will reveal that there is a need for this in several areas. So, for example, retail often caters to the needs of newly arrived migrants who want food that they're familiar with, who want packaging that they can read, because they maybe haven't signed up for English lessons yet. We will find that hospital settings often require and really do need multilingual signage so that people can access the healthcare that they need. So we will find that certain areas of Coventry might be more primed to have linguistic landscapes that are multilingual. And that might take away some of our surprise and help to direct the focus of our research question, so that instead of asking, why does Coventry have multilingual signposts, we say, why is there a lack of signage in Somali in Coventry when there are so many Somali speakers in Coventry? We can start to narrow down the focus of the research question and ask more targeted questions. So all good research should have these elements in. And you do need all of these elements. You can start to think about these as headings in your project. So in your own mind, you can already start to write your document. Yeah, you can open a Word document and say, term 1, assessment, RAPS, and you can put the module code on and you can start to put these subheadings and feed in your own ideas. What makes a good researcher then? Well, I think you've all shown already that you're curious. You want to know. If you didn't want to know, I don't think you would be in higher education. You must stay open-minded. So you have to, even if you formulate a hypothesis that says, for example, Coventry is an entirely monolingual city and there is no evidence of any multilingualism reflected in the signposts there. That's a deliberate formatting of something that I don't believe, so that I can interrogate that robustly. I'm going to remain open-minded though. Perhaps I'm imagining that I will find lots and lots of multilingual signage, but if I go and look, perhaps I won't find very much. And then I have to ask myself, I who thought that I knew everything, why is this? Why isn't there very much multilingual signage when there are clearly on the census lots and lots of people whose first language is not English? I have to be able to detach myself from my findings. I might not like what I find. That is of no interest at all. That is of no interest to the scientific mind at all. If I don't like the results, as long as they are robust and I can defend finding them, that is of no interest to us. We have to reflect reality. We must also be able to reflect in a very detached way on what we have done, and we must be able to reflect critically. So you should be able to criticise yourself, but also to reflect and engage with what you've done so that you can say, I think I did this to the best of my ability with the data that I had and the methods I chose, but other researchers might want to take this on by doing X, Y, and Z. I have done A, B, and C. in hindsight, I shouldn't have done B because it wasn't profitable and I didn't get enough data, or the data that I got were compromised and I don't feel that they were good data. I would recommend that you don't carry out step B, but I would recommend that you do a further step, D, which I ran out of time for. We must be knowledgeable with respect to research methods, and to that end we are going to start reading about different research methods and reflecting on their uses, when they might be inappropriate. So we will start to read about the use of the questionnaire in social sciences work, the use of the Likert scale in social psychological work. We will start to think about the use of RStudio in the coming weeks for doing statistical analysis of quantitative data. And we will start to think about the limits of these methods, how we might actually cross-reference these methods so that we are using more than one. Would that help us to get a more robust finding, or a finding that looks at a problem from two different angles? A good researcher is usually experienced, especially in qualitative research. So the more you interview, the more you will find that you probably have an interview style. When I interview, I tend to talk too much, and that can be problematic, even if you have a very quiet informant. So if you simply keep talking, you allow your informant no space at all to answer you and no space to reflect or expand on their answers. And that's something that I've had to learn to curb over the years of interviewing. So you will get experience, but you can only do that, this is the rub, you can only do that by conducting research, which is why we start so early in this department. A good researcher is creative, and that certainly is going to be something you're good at. You've already started being creative. You have come to university in a most unusual year. You are already engaging with methods that students before you have not engaged with and would perhaps not have enjoyed engaging with. You are creative. You think your way round problems. You think your way through stumbling blocks. You think your way through how to access informants and data. You're disciplined, so you can work at a pace. And you mustn't just avoid working on your research project. So really the motto is little and often. Do a little of your work every day if you can. Do some reading every day. Do some working on your assessment every day. Do some reflecting on the reading that you've done and some writing up of notes. And you're responsible and ethical. So that is, we will teach you about the ethical codes that are expected of you for social sciences research. And you must stick to them for moral grounds and for your own safety and your own legal protection. You're going to need to stick to those, but you should do this out of moral obligations to your informants. So you will set up a code of ethics and they will sign a consent form. You must stick to what you told them. You must handle their data in confidence. You must do what that you told them, and if you promise them outputs from your research, you must make sure that they reach that research, that community that gave you the data. So you must act ethically. Back to methodology then. What's methodology? Well, Strauss and Corbin, again, who I should say they are on the qualitative side of research. Strauss and Corbin say that methodology is a way of thinking about and studying social reality. And we began to talk about reality last week. We talked about subjective and objective reality. So objective reality, seeing colours, seeing shapes, hearing noises, okay? Subjective reality, hearing a noise and finding it pleasant, hearing a noise and finding it unpleasant. Okay, but methodology is, they are ways of thinking about and ways of studying these realities. I think that's a good definition. They also say there are a set of procedures and techniques for gathering and analysing data. Well, good, we talked about this. So really what we're doing with methodology and methods is we're thinking of the way that we view the world. So methodology says something about the way we view the world. And we might want to interrogate our worldview. And in fact, scientists often do this. Scientists often have to hypothesize because they're not sure of the effect a certain drug will have on your system. They can hypothesize based on the effect they know similar drugs have had, but they can't say for sure. And we are the same. So if we go back to my example from week 1 of the glottal stop, I can hypothesize that H dropping will have a similarly dispreferred status in the UK, but I can't know until I go and carry that research out. Till I ask people, do you prefer the sentence, I wear an hat when I'm on my horse, or I wear a hat when I'm on my horse? I cannot know until I've gone and asked a representative number of people whether this is true or not. So I cannot know what is their subjective reality. And I cannot begin to grasp at what objective reality might be until I've gone and asked a large number of people about these two sentences, till I've begun to elicit some reactions to H dropping. I might want to go back to other dispreferred structures like glottally and say that because glottally is dispreferred, H dropping will be, but I can't know that for certain. That's just evidence to guide my hypothesis. It doesn't actually tell me anything about H dropping and its status in the UK. I have to do that work for myself. So just as methodology encodes our way of thinking about the world, the methods that we use will reflect that. They will be a set of procedures and techniques to help us get hold of the data that will help us answer these questions. And if I want to know about the status of H dropping, I've got to ask people, here's some data with an H drop in it, here's some data without an H drop in it, where someone says horse and hat. Which one do you prefer? And you can already see the problems. Which sentence shall I ask them first? Shall I ask about the H dropped one, or shall I ask about the one with the H first? Because whichever I do, I've primed them. If I ask about the horse and the at first, it is likely, we might argue that it is likely that a UK speaker will pick up on what I'm interested in. They will begin to understand that I'm interested in the h variable, the presence or absence of h word initially. If I ask about at and horse first, I think that's quite likely to happen. But even if I ask about hats and horses and high horses, they still might pick up on it, because you notice that there are lots and lots of h's in that sentence. And if we're right, if h is socially salient in the UK, then they're going to start to pick up on that. So methodology is, in a sense, always circular. We're always questioning our own beliefs, and the methods that we use have to be constantly refined to try and avoid bias. So there's lots to think about here. Okay. So I would like you now to go to the discussion online that I've put up for this week, and we're going to talk, if you're ready, if you've looked at the topics, we're going to talk about research questions, research problems, and research areas, and the difference between those. So what you've been given for your assessments is, in essence, a set of research areas, and in some cases a research problem. What we're going to talk about is how to get from the bottom of this list to the top. So how do we get from noticing a research area to noticing a research problem, and to then refining that into a research question? So if you would now go and make a post on that forum, we can take that into the seminar this week and we can talk about that. So do have a break now and go and do that. So some caveats for this, and you may want to go and revisit what you've posted. When we formulate a research question, we have to be able to answer this, and the main stumbling block for this is, can we physically do this in the time available to us? So if you look at the deadline for your assessment, you will see that we have the whole of the term, and that's it. You don't have much longer than that. So can we answer this? A, in the time that we have. B, using the data that we're proposing to gather. Are we trying to gather too much data? And I have to say that is the perennial problem with new researchers. They are too ambitious. They seek to gather too much data. The problem with gathering data is that it has to be processed and interpreted, and that is what takes the time. So can we do it using the data that we propose to gather? If the question doesn't work, the whole project won't work, and sometimes, although it shouldn't work this way, the nature of the data we gather dictates the research question. It should work the other way around. In an ideal world, the research question that we set should dictate the data that we gather. But in fact, they do bleed into each other a little bit. So we can talk about this on the forum as well. Once we've all made our posts, I will comment, and we will talk about this in the seminar. The research questions that we are proposing, are they going to be answered by the data that we propose to get? So if we're going to look, for example, at fake news, what are we going to do to answer a research question which deals with, is fake news on the rise? And if we hypothesize fake news has risen in the last year in the UK, how are we going to deal with a research question like that? How are we going to interrogate a hypothesis like that? Do we have to gather all news reports from the UK in the last year? That's clearly far too much data. Are we going to gather news reports from one newspaper in the last year? Perhaps we might find that there's some political bias there. So we might propose that we want to look across left and right-wing newspapers. We might want to get news from The Guardian, which is kind of the last nominally left-wing broadsheet that there is, and The Times. But The Times is behind a paywall, so there's a hurdle there. How do we get articles from the Times. Okay, we might want to work around that, and we'll find that we have a university subscription, so that's good. You can see already that there are hurdles to this. Already, if we propose to gather news articles from the Times and the Guardian, that's a lot of data already. So it might be too much data, and we might not be able to process it all in time. You can see that formulating a research question is an ongoing process which will require several stages of refinement, and that's what I want to start to think about on the forums this week and in the seminar when we meet face to face. If the question doesn't work, the whole project won't work. And concomitantly, if the data set is wrong, you won't be able to answer the question. So this is what we need to think about. A good research question, then, should show that you're ready to carry out the project. It should be a refined research question. It should be well phrased as well, and we can come on to that. I'm quite good at helping people to phrase research questions. As long as you have a set of problems that you wish to interrogate and you formulated a question from that, then that is good. The opposite will be true if it's vague, if it's too wide, if it's irrelevant, if it isn't informed by the literature. So if you haven't taken time to do the reading to eliminate what we already know. So for example, there may be an article out which is a huge meta-review of The Guardian and The Times and concludes that the sources that The Guardian and The Times use are utterly reliable and not fake, and that there's no statistics misreported in either of those two broadsheets, in which case it's A, irrelevant, and B, it wasn't literature informed, which is why it's irrelevant. If we have a leading question which suggests that we favour one side of this over the other, so if we say fake news is massively on the rise in the UK, I think the use of the adverb massively suggests that we are emotionally invested in this. Even if we believe this, we have to treat it as if it weren't a given. We must do this. We must sit on the fence. We must say, interrogating the authenticity of the news in the UK, a study. Okay. Questions must be clearly formed. So research questions can be 2-part or 3-part, but there must be then 3 clear questions. Okay, so we must say something like, it has been suggested that fake news is on the rise in the UK. With reference to The Guardian and The Times, I look at 12 articles from each and answer the 2-part question. Are the sources that they cite reliable? Do they report their statistics in an accurate way? So there are 2 questions. They must be well informed, so do make sure nobody else has answered specifically your question. That's not to say that people haven't done lots and lots of work on the accuracy of broadsheet reporting, but that nobody has actually answered your question, so nobody has compared 12 articles from The Times and The Guardian in the last year. It's unlikely, to be honest, but you must make sure that you're not duplicating. That's not good research. And finally, they must be doable with the affordances of time and labour that you have. Well, the labour is you, and the time that you have is approximately 12 weeks. How do we do a literature review then? Well, there'll be some links on your Moodle page by the time that we meet this week, and you can start to look through those. But literature reviews look at a topic or maybe a few topics. And we start by looking at relevant articles. So if I were going to do a literature review, I would go to the library and I would get the website search bar up and I would put keywords in. So I would say, for example, fake news, broadsheet, tabloid. I would start to put those articles in. I would start to put those keywords in, I beg your pardon. And I would see what hits I get from the library. So there might be a big book on fake news. And then I might start to think about, well, it matters here. It matters whether I look at recent hits or older hits, because the way that we present the news has changed in the last 20 years. Most news editing is now done online. Things can be updated within minutes of something happening, whereas with the print press we had a lag of at least overnight if things were going to be in the headlines, so you would wait for the morning papers. This has changed. We look for relevant articles, and we might want to include the date that they were published as an issue of relevance. For other things that we're doing, that might not be relevant at all. If I'm researching Old English, it doesn't matter so much because the texts that I'm studying are fixed, they don't change, nobody adds to Old English scripts. Beowulf is not going to change or be edited. People might quibble over the translation of a certain word, but the manuscripts themselves, they remain where they are, static. So it doesn't matter so much if the literature is slightly older. But on topics like fake news, it certainly does matter. And we're going to look at a certain topic, so we're going to focus on fake news, or Old English manuscripts, or linguistic landscapes in the city of Coventry. We're going to use, if we can, the systematic approach. So we're going to try and go through all the hits on the library catalogue, download all the possible sources that are relevant, we will begin by skim reading the abstracts on these sources. So most chapters and most peer-reviewed articles come with an abstract, which is kind of a nutshell of what the paper tells us. You can look at these and you can very quickly decide, is this relevant or not? Well, it said fake news, but actually it's about fake news in Serbia. I can't read Serbian. I also am not interested in Serbian news journalism, so I shall eliminate that from my studies, though I might want to keep it in a folder for later. Okay, so we're going to use a systematic approach to including and excluding reviews, things that we look at. So going through this systematic approach, the next thing we can do with a literature review is look at the sources that others have looked at. So once you've got a review, have a look at the studies that they're quoting. Do you need to go to the studies that they're quoting and also get those studies? And for that, you might want something like Google Scholar. So you might want to open Google Scholar because Google is obviously functioning as a kind of proxy corpus for a lot of the knowledge that is on the web. It scrapes the web for everything that is out there, and Google Scholar is refined to only throw up academic sources so that we can look across the world's universities at papers and we can look at fake news around the world. And then we might find that we find more information from Anglophone countries. So fake news in Zambia, is it on the rise? And we might say, well, this is written in English. Perhaps the newspapers are put together in the same kind of way. Perhaps I could use some academic papers from Zambia. Perhaps I could do that. Perhaps I could use some Australian research on fake news. That would be good because there's some really modern stuff coming out of news journalism in Australia, where there's not been so much in England and in the UK this year. So we're going to use a systematic approach to search for articles and to search for books. And then we're going to start to report those findings in our literature reviews. And we will practice doing that as the weeks go by. Why review then? Why bother? Well, I think we've covered most of this. We want to identify gaps in the literature. We do need to make sure we're not missing something. And I can tell you that you nearly always miss something in a literature review. It's really hard to do a literature review comprehensively, and it's one of the things you will have to let go of as you research. When you write something up, you'll be writing up ready to submit the next day, and you'll find a paper that you haven't read. By that stage, it is too late. Okay, it is too late to read that paper. And you might just want to admit in your conclusion that this is something that you didn't get round to reading, or that offers good avenues for further directions. But you will find that things are in press and get published as you're writing. That's not something we can do anything about. As long as you've made strenuous efforts to identify everything that was published at the time, that's enough. It stops us making the mistakes others have made. It saves us time. And it helps us to build on what others have done. So we're actually helping fellow academics because we are building on what they've done. If you go on into academia, or if you go into the professional world, it actually helps you to identify other people working in the same fields as you, which is a kind of social networking, if you like. But it's very helpful because you will find others who disagree vehemently with you, or who really do agree with you, and with whom you can build good working relationships with, hopefully, as you seek to gain knowledge and change practice in the world, change people's opinions in the world, or just help people to keep the same opinion. Okay. And it enables us to increase our breadth of knowledge. So really, if we review the literature, if we read the literature, we gain much more understanding of how methods are applied. We become more knowledgeable. So it is really worth doing well. It also helps us to identify key works in our area. And as you do more and more literature reviews, you will come again across the same sources if you stick to the same topics. The same sources will be important throughout your career. It enables you to, if we go back to the idea of subjective versus objective reality, it'll enable you to position your project and your views on objective reality relative to other work. You'll be able to identify opposing views, and you should engage robustly with opposing views. So you should read work that you completely disagree with, that you don't enjoy reading. You are not a good academic if you don't do this. This is not a good idea. You will not be good at defending your own views, at interrogating them properly, and you may even miss something. You may even miss data that hasn't been reported in your own field. It puts your work into a much wider perspective to do a literature review, so you can see where it fits in, and you can see that fake news is, from what I was talking about with my mythical literature review, fake news is something that is troubling the whole world over. It is not just a problem in the Anglophone journalism world, it's a problem everywhere. We can put that into really stark relief, okay? And we can see that we can access previous work in an area. You need to be able to do that. You need to be able to do that as researchers. So you're going to find some sources hard to access. So some of you will need to ask the library to bring things up from stores. You will need older books that are held in the stores of the library. Many of you will find that we don't hold all of the sources you would like, and you're going to have to ask the library, can they do an interlibrary loan? You may even find that some things are not digitally available, and you may have to ask for things to be digitised by the British Library or the National Library of Scotland. We will teach you how to do that. Most of all, we need to be able to identify information and ideas that are relevant for the projects we're doing, and we need to identify the methods that could be relevant. So we might find a method that didn't work for somebody else. We might think, well, I've never heard of this method before, but this seems pretty good. I'll try this. This seems like this might be what I'm looking for. So it enables us to look across everything that has been done by others, to learn from their mistakes and to build on the strengths that they have, and to produce new work more robustly. Right, so please pick one of the scenarios on Moodle. Please pick one of the research scenarios on Moodle and come up with a mini design for it. You can think of anything you like, but it does have to be relevant to this course, and it has to be doable. Having done this, you should prepare a small research poster, and I will give you a sort of crib, if you like, which you may change. I will give you a little tiny research crib with a list of the things that should be included on the poster. You should prepare a small poster to share with us about your methods and your methodology using PowerPoint. Upload the poster to the forum, which will be named Poster Forum, and set up in week 3 section. Please do that by the time we meet next week, and we will, that is week 3, not this week for the seminar, by the time we meet in week 3, please do that, and it can function as the beginning of your assessment. So choose one of the topics and start to research that topic. Start to come up with a mini design for that topic, please. Okay, some good references here, but if we want more references, there are plenty in the reading list, so do look through. Do look again also at our ebook, which is our core text, and do ask me if you require any references specific to the topic that you choose before next week, and I'm absolutely more than happy to answer emails. And thank you for listening.